4 explosions, 3 hours, 4 different cities inside Russia, all of them burning, not near the front line, not in contested territory, deep inside Russia, in cities where people went to sleep last night thinking the war was somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere that wasn't their city, their street, their window glowing orange at 2 in the morning. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. The facilities that burned last night weren't chosen randomly. They weren't hit by luck. Every single one of them was selected because destroying it makes Russia's military weaker in a very specific, very measurable way, starting today, not eventually. Today, this morning, right now, as Russian commanders are looking at damage reports and trying to figure out how to explain to Moscow why 4 facilities that were supposed to be safe, that were positioned specifically because they were supposed to be beyond Ukraine's reach, are now smoking craters on satellite imagery that anyone in the world can pull up on their phone. Something fundamentally changed last night. And I don't mean that in the dramatic YouTube way where everything is always the biggest development ever. I mean it in the specific structural, military, strategic sense where a capability that didn't exist publicly yesterday now exists publicly today. And that capability cannot be unmade, cannot be undemonstrated, cannot be walked back by any statement from any Ministry of Defense anywhere. The strikes happened. The fires burned. The satellite imagery exists. And the targeting system that produced those 4 strikes is still running right now. So stay with me for the next few minutes because I want to walk you through exactly what happened last night, exactly why Russia cannot stop it, and exactly what it means for how this war develops from here. Because the story that matters isn't the fires. The fires are just the visible result. The story that matters is the system that produced them, why it works, why Russia's air defenses failed to stop it, and what happens when Ukraine points that same system at the Tier 1 target list that last night's strikes were never actually on. Last night was not the main event. Last night was the proof of concept. And understanding the difference between those two things is the difference between understanding what just happened and missing the entire point. Let me start with the 4 locations because the specifics matter more than the general picture. First explosion, 11:43 p.m. Moscow time, near Voronezh, a fuel and lubricants depot, not a random fuel storage facility. The specific depot supplying diesel and specialized military lubricants to armored vehicle operations on the southern axis. We're talking approximately 2 million liters of diesel. The fire burned for 6 hours, assessed as a total loss. The armored vehicles that depot was feeding, the ones conducting Russia's grinding offensive operations in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, they now operate from reduced reserves. Reduced reserves mean reduced operational range. Reduced operational range means they cannot mass for attacks the way Russian offensive doctrine requires them to. That one strike, that one fire, changes the calculus of armored operations on the southern axis starting today. 40 minutes later, Lipetsk, a communications relay station. And this one is subtle in a way that makes it strategically more significant than it looks. This isn't a big, obvious military installation. It's a facility disguised as commercial telecommunications infrastructure. But what it actually does is serve as a node connecting Russian military command posts along the southern axis with the general staff in Moscow. Taking it offline doesn't cut communications entirely. It forces rerouting through secondary channels, slower channels, less secure channels, channels that are more vulnerable to Ukrainian signals intelligence collection. Every Russian military communication that now has to route through that degraded secondary network is a communication that takes longer, carries more risk, and arrives with less certainty than it did the night before. Then Tambov, a maintenance and repair facility for Russia's electronic warfare systems. The systems Russia uses to jam Ukrainian FPV drone attacks on the front line. And here's why this target is so elegant from a military planning perspective. Ukraine didn't strike the jammers themselves. Striking the jammers themselves would have required getting assets much closer to the front line, much closer to concentrated Russian air defenses. Instead, Ukraine struck the facility that keeps the jammers operational, the spare parts stockpile, the technical workspace, the personnel, the infrastructure that repairs them when they break. And jammers break constantly in a contested electromagnetic environment. They require continuous maintenance to remain effective. That maintenance capability just took a serious hit, which means the jammers on the front line, starting from their next maintenance cycle, are working from a degraded support system. Ukrainian FPV drone teams on the front line will notice the difference. They'll notice it in engagement success rates. They'll notice it in the specific sectors where Russian jamming effectiveness begins to degrade. And they won't know exactly why at first, but the targeting analysts in Kyiv will know exactly why. And then the fourth target, back near Voronezh, a different facility, an ammunition transfer point. The specific facility moving 152 millimeter artillery shells into the forward supply pipeline for Russian guns on the Zaporizhzhia axis, partially destroyed. Transfer capacity estimated down 60 to 70% for a minimum of 2 weeks. 2 weeks of 60 to 70% reduced throughput. Do the math on what that means for Russian artillery fire rates on that axis. Russian artillery has been one of the defining features of this war. The grinding, overwhelming, attritional fire that Russia uses to advance slowly but continuously across the front. Reduce the ammunition throughput, you reduce the fire rate. Reduce the fire rate, you reduce the advance. It is that direct, that mechanical, that measurable. 4 strikes, 4 targets, each one specifically chosen not just for what it destroys, but for the downstream operational effect that destruction produces on the front line. This is not terrorism. This is not random harassment. This is surgical, sequenced, strategically coherent targeting designed to degrade Russian combat power in ways that compound each other. Less fuel means less armored mobility. Less armored mobility means less offensive capacity. Less jamming maintenance means more successful Ukrainian drone strikes against that already reduced armor. Less artillery ammunition means less suppression of Ukrainian positions. Less suppression means Ukrainian forces can operate more aggressively. Every single one of these effects feeds the others. Now let's talk about the how, because the how is the part that should genuinely concern Russian military planners in a way that no individual strike can concern them. Ukraine has built what military analysts are now describing as an integrated long-range autonomous strike network. And I want to be precise about what that means because it's not just a fancy way of saying big drones. It's a system, an architecture, multiple layers working together to produce an effect that none of them could produce individually. The platform layer is autonomous long-range kamikaze drones, larger than the FPV drones you see in Frontline footage, purpose-built for deep strike. Their exact range is still partially classified, but last night's operations publicly demonstrated they can reliably hit hardened targets more than 400 kilometers inside Russian territory. That number matters because 400 kilometers is the distance at which Russian military planners decided certain assets were safe. That decision is now operationally void, but the platform is almost the least interesting part of the system. The more important layer is the targeting intelligence architecture. Ukraine has built an AI-assisted fusion system that pulls together satellite imagery, signals intelligence intercepts, human intelligence from networks operating inside Russia, and historical pattern analysis. And it correlates all of it continuously to produce target coordinates that reflect where an asset is right now, not where it was last week. That distinction is critical because military assets move, supplies get shifted, facilities adapt. A targeting system working from week-old imagery hits empty ground. A targeting system updating coordinates in near real time hits what it's aimed at. Then there's the routing layer. Ukraine has spent more than 2 years mapping Russian air defense geography through signals intelligence collection. Every documented radar installation, every known electronic warfare bubble, every documented air defense engagement zone, every terrain feature that creates a radar shadow. The routing algorithm doesn't try to fight through Russian air defenses. It routes around them through the gaps, through the shadows, through the specific corridors that Russian coverage doesn't cleanly reach. And Russia knows those gaps exist. The problem is that plugging one gap creates another somewhere else. The geometry of air defense coverage doesn't allow for a seamless solution. There will always be corridors. Ukraine's system finds them and uses them. And finally, the coordination layer. The system that manages multiple platforms simultaneously deconflicts their routes, sequences their arrivals to maximize disruption of Russian response, and updates all of them in real time from the same intelligence feed. Last night, 4 platforms approached 4 separate targets in 3 separate oblasts, and all 4 arrived within a 40-minute window. That's not luck. That's coordinated autonomous navigation at a level of precision that speaks to years of development and testing. So why can't Russia stop it? Russia has some of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. S-400s, Pantsir, Buk, overlapping layers of coverage. This is a genuine question and it deserves a genuine answer. Part of it is physics. Russia's air defense radars are optimized for specific threat profiles. High-altitude aircraft, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles at medium and high altitude. They are not optimized for very small, very slow, very low-flying platforms that barely distinguish themselves from birds on radar screens calibrated for much faster, much larger threats. A platform with a radar cross-section of a few square centimeters flying at 50 meters altitude at 100 kilometers per hour presents a fundamentally different detection challenge than the threat profiles those systems were designed to engage. Part of it is the routing intelligence we just discussed. Ukraine doesn't fight through the coverage. It goes around it. And going around it is possible because Ukraine has spent 2 years building the most detailed picture of Russian air defense geography that any outside party has ever assembled. And part of it is saturation. 4 simultaneous targets means 4 simultaneous approach routes from potentially different vectors. Russian air defense units that detect one platform face an immediate decision problem. Engage the contact they can see or wait for confirmation that it's not a decoy while the others are already past their engagement range. The decision timeline is too compressed. The radar picture is too complex. Some platforms get through. Last night, apparently all 4 did. And part of it is geography. Russia's most capable air defense assets are concentrated near the front line, defending the most immediately threatened areas. The deep rear was, until last night, considered safe by Russian planning standards. Safe is not the same as defended. There is a distinction between those 2 words that 4 burning facilities now make impossible to ignore. Russia is not sitting still. Let's be honest about that. Russia is adapting. Russia's military has been learning from this war for 3 years, and it's not stupid. In the hours after last night's strikes, Russia began emergency redeployment of air defense assets from the front line toward the deep rear. And that response is correct. It is also exactly what Ukraine wants to see happen, because every air defense system that moves from the front line to cover facilities in Voronezh and Lipetsk and Tambov is a system that is no longer covering positions on the front line. Ukrainian intelligence is watching those movements, tracking which systems left which positions, mapping the new gaps in frontline air defense coverage that the redeployment creates. Those gaps feed the drone targeting on the front line. Ukraine hits the rear. Russia redistributes to cover the rear. The front thins. Ukraine's frontline operations gain more freedom of action. The response to the deep strike creates the conditions for the shallow strike to succeed. Russia is being forced to choose which problem to defend against, and whichever one it prioritizes, it accepts greater vulnerability to the other. Russia is also beginning to disperse logistics assets, breaking up consolidated facilities into smaller, more distributed positions that are individually less valuable as targets. This is also the correct response. It is also expensive. Dispersal reduces logistics efficiency. It complicates the supply chain to the front line. It increases transit time. It multiplies the administrative burden of managing supplies moving forward. And here's the thing that should trouble Russian planners most. Dispersal doesn't make assets invisible. Ukraine's targeting system finds dispersed assets. It just takes slightly longer. Russia is buying time with dispersal. It is not solving the underlying problem. The targeting system is still running. The intelligence feed is still updating. The next target list is being built right now from the pattern of where things are moving. There's a layer to this that doesn't show up in targeting databases or damage assessments, but that shapes how wars actually develop over time. What last night did to the people living in Voronezh and Lipetsk and Tambov. These are not frontline cities. They are not in occupied territories or contested zones. They are cities deep inside Russia where ordinary people have been living with a managed narrative that says the war is somewhere else, happening to other people, being handled by a military that is strong and whose air defenses work and whose territory is protected. Those people went to sleep last night inside that narrative, and some of them woke up to explosions, to smoke, to fires visible from apartment windows, to the specific sensory experience of a war that was not supposed to be there arriving in their city anyway. Russian state media will explain this. It will say the strikes were largely intercepted. It will say they were Ukrainian terrorism. It will attribute them to Western aggression. It will find a frame that fits within the narrative it has been constructing for 3 years. But the people in Voronezh who smelled the smoke will have a piece of direct sensory evidence that no state media framing can fully override. They will know, in the specific way that only lived experience produces knowledge, that something reached their city that their government told them couldn't. And that knowledge, once it exists, does not disappear. You can suppress reporting. You can arrest people who spread what you define as false information about military operations. You cannot make people unremember the smell of smoke in their own neighborhood. The Ministry of Defense statement this morning called the strikes largely intercepted provocations. 4 facilities. 6 hours of visible fire on satellite imagery documented by independent analysts using publicly available commercial remote sensing data. Largely intercepted. The gap between that statement and the satellite imagery is not just a public relations problem. It is an internal command problem. If Russian commanders are reporting to Moscow that the strikes were largely intercepted, then the senior leadership is making resource allocation and response decisions based on a damage picture that understates the actual damage, under-responding to the real repair requirement, under-correcting the actual logistics capacity reduction. And Ukraine knows this. Ukraine strikes specifically in ways designed to widen the gap between what state media reports and what actually happened. Because the gap, once wide enough, produces command decisions calibrated to false premises. And false premises produce failed operations. Here's where the intelligence picture and the operational logic point when you project them forward. The 4 targets struck last night were Tier 2 targets. High value, operationally significant, absolutely worth striking, but not the top of the list. The Tier 1 targets for this campaign are structural. The artillery ammunition production facilities in Nizhny Novgorod and Yekaterinburg. The actual plants producing 152 millimeter and 120 millimeter shells that Russian artillery consumes at rates exceeding 10,000 rounds per day. Hit those facilities, not the forward storage, not the transfer points, but the production source itself, and Russia's artillery problem transforms from a supply chain problem solvable in days into a manufacturing problem requiring months. The drone component factories in Alabuga and elsewhere where Russia has been scaling up production of the weapons it uses against Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian energy infrastructure. The oil refinery infrastructure that converts crude oil into the diesel and aviation fuel that powers the entire military machine. And the target that analysts who have been watching this campaign believe represents the ultimate operational objective, the railway bridges. The specific bridges that military logistics traffic uses to move ammunition, fuel, and equipment from production centers in Russia's interior to the front. Take out the right bridges in the right sequence, and Russia's ability to resupply the front line collapses from rail capacity to road capacity. A fraction of the throughput. an unsolvable logistics crisis that cannot be fixed in the time frame of this war. That target list exists. It has been built. It has been updated. Last night demonstrated that the system works at the range and accuracy required to execute against it. What comes next is not more proof of concept. What comes next is the application of a proven capability against targets whose destruction would be structurally decisive in ways that last night's strikes, as significant as they were, are not. The title of what you're watching says Russia is losing control. Let me be precise about what that means because I don't want to oversell it. Russia is not collapsing. Russia has strategic depth. It has population. It has nuclear weapons. It has the capacity to absorb significant damage and continue operating. What Russia is losing control of is something more specific. It's losing control of the foundational assumption that made its logistics architecture for this war possible. The assumption that the deep rear is safe. That assumption determined where everything was positioned, where ammunition is stored, where fuel is kept, where command infrastructure is located, where repair facilities were built, where production was concentrated. Last night demonstrated that assumption is wrong. Not wrong in a way that requires revision. Wrong in a way that means everything positioned according to it is now a potential target. And repositioning takes months, in some cases years, during which time the targeting system keeps running and the target list keeps updating. Russia is also losing control of the narrative at home, not all at once, not in a single moment, but incrementally, strike by strike, fire by fire, in the specific accumulation of lived experiences that cannot be managed out of existence by the tools of information control. Every explosion in a Russian city that state media calls, largely intercepted while the satellite imagery shows 6 hours of fire. Every moment where the gap between the official account and the observable reality becomes visible to ordinary people. Every person in Voronezh who opens a VPN and pulls up satellite imagery and sees their city burning and reads that it was largely intercepted. That gap, accumulated over time, becomes the domestic crisis that runs alongside the military crisis. Ukraine is not trying to produce that moment with a single spectacular strike. It is engineering a campaign designed to make that moment structurally inevitable. Last night, 4 explosions, 3 hours. Cities inside Russia burning that were supposed to be beyond reach. A system demonstrated publicly that cannot be undemonstrated. A targeting architecture that is still running, still collecting, still building the next list. Last night wasn't the campaign. Last night was the opening. And what opens cannot be closed by the tools Russia currently has available to close it.